if you ask the question, what would Orwell have thought about Antifa? That's rather a difficult question in this. It's difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, Orwell was an anti-fascist, called himself an anti-fascist, and was very. Although he went through a period of what the communists would call ultra-leftism, where he was very much opposed to a war against fascism, and that lasted from, let's say, June 1937 to August 1939, when he suddenly, as a result of a dream he had, and I'm not making this up, he suddenly became very pro-war. This was a period where everybody knew the war with Germany was coming, and most of the left was saying it was an anti-fascist war. And Orwell suddenly, overnight, about a week before the actual war broke out, in early September 1939, Orwell became pro-war. Now he was an anti-fascist. One of the things that I experienced actually when I was at university in the late 1960s was there were Trotskyist groups that would use violence against certain speakers who they categorized as fascist, although these speakers were not fascist in any sense that Orwell would have recognized, or in any sense that the 1930s left would have recognized. For instance, Enoch Powell, the leading British politician who was very much in favor of imposing restrictions on coloured immigration into Britain, they would break up his meetings and attack people. And they would say this was anti-fascism. Now, so what we're witnessing now in the US, where Antifa goes and attacks people who are not, they're in many cases attacking people who are not doing anything violent just because of their views. But these views can be Christian, conservative, libertarian, or anything. They attack all kinds of people, and they claim to be attacking fascism. But they're not. But the people, they're defining fascism so broadly that it means anything that doesn't fit in with about 2% of the population who agree with the extreme left views of Antifa. Now, Orwell, of course, lived at a time when there were pitched battles in the streets between left and right. This was a familiar feature of European society in the 30s. In London, the Black Shirts, the British Union of Fascists, organized marches through the East End of London, which over the previous, let's say, 50 years had become heavily Jewish because of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire. And the communists and fellow travelers went along to attack Mosley and the Black Shirts. So there were pitched battles in the streets. But what's different today is that the fascists were genuinely fascists, and the people attacking them were openly communists for the most part. So you had two groups, fascists and communists, both of which who had the support of considerably less than 1% each of the British population. So none of them could make a showing in elections. You had these two groups battling in the streets. So that was what was going on in London in Orwell's day. What you've got today, it seems to me, is a group of people who attack anybody for anything. You know, if you take the view that men dressed as women shouldn't be able to get into girls' bathrooms, then you're going to be a fascist and you're going to get your head beaten in by Antifa. So, it's a completely different kind of situation. It's a bit different if Orwell was suddenly moved to 2017. Would Orwell think that Donald Trump was a fascist? I don't see much sign of Donald Trump trying to abolish democratic government or having bands of stormtroopers parading through the streets and all these sort of obvious signs of Italian fascism or Spanish nationalism or German National Socialism. Many of them seem to be missing. I suppose it does seem to me that there is a similarity, and that is economic nationalism, a belief that foreign countries are our enemies, and we can only do better if we outdo them, and we must also outdo their agents, domestic agents in our own country. So that's a sort of a theme that's a bit similar between Trumpism and fascism. But Trump so far has not shown any anti-democratic inclinations, and has not, and the Trump people have not engaged in violence. I imagine if Orwell was brought, he'd see a big difference between fascism as he knew it and Trumpism. But the point is, Antifa don't just attack Trumpists; they attack anybody who isn't themselves. There are people who go to these demonstrations who are constitutionalists who believe in free speech, and they go to make the point that free speech should be tolerated. They get their heads bashed in by Antifa. Antifa doesn't hand out questionnaires. What is your ideological orientation? If you're not with Antifa, you get your head bashed in. They're just thugs. But by the way, I think they do have a sophisticated theory behind their thuggery. But maybe just thugs is wrong. They're thugs with an ideology. It's a different situation today. And fascism isn't a threat in the United States today. Nothing like fascism is a threat in the United States today. There was a fascist movement in Italy. It had a very precise ideology, and they called itself fascism. And the National Socialists in Germany were very emphatic that they were not fascist. There were international gatherings of fascists, and the Nazis refused to attend because they said, we're not fascists. So that's what I meant, really. Now, there is also fascism as a theoretical category of the left. The left theory was that capitalism was in its last throes, and the capitalists were losing their grip because of the declining rate of profit, as predicted by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital, and that in desperation, the capitalists had paid the fascists to reduce the living standards of the workers so as to prolong capitalism a bit longer. So the left view of fascism in the 1930s is very much bound up with the view that Orwell believed, actually, that capitalism is at the end of its rope, and that this is the last gasp. And in fact, the Communist Party sometimes said the coming to power of fascists is a welcome sign, because it means that capitalism is in its final death agony. Now, nobody today thinks that capitalism's in its last throes, at least. I believe David Graeber does think that for environmental reasons, but generally speaking, the left doesn't think that. The left's attitude to fascism in the 1930s was completely conditioned by this view. I mean, the reason so many people went to fight in Spain was because this was one of the hinges of history. What was the untold thousands of years hung upon the fate of the Spanish Revolution, because it was fascism versus the working class. That's the way they saw it, and it was quite wrong, of course. As we now know, capitalism has a lot of life left in it, and it wasn't at the end of its rope, and it isn't at the end of its rope now. So that's a big difference. It seems to me that Antifa and people like that, they hark back to these earlier epochs, but it's not really you can't really transpose these ideas because we're dealing with successful capitalism that is abolishing poverty throughout the world, capitalism that is lifting millions of people to untold heights of well-being. That's what's actually going on in the world today. In the 1930s, there was the Great Depression, and in Britain, Britain and Germany, it was particularly bad because Britain had a slump throughout the 20s. as well as getting worse in the 30s, in Germany they'd had hyperinflation and recession in the 1920s. So there was a general gloom and doom about the future on all sides. Today we're dealing with vibrant capitalism that is triumphing everywhere and that is improving the lot of everybody in the world at a fantastic rate. I mean, looking at the long view, what's going on in China and India, huge sections of the world's population are seeing palpable increases in their real income from year to year. This is the exact opposite of the way things were perceived in the 1930s, when it was perceived that everything was shrinking, everything was coming to an end. There was the old Marxist idea that no social order ever disappears until it's used up all its potential. That idea that you're getting capital, and capitalism seemed to have used up all its potential. But nobody thinks that anymore.